Hello, everyone. My name is Moshe Nave from the SAP community team. Today, in this SAP community call, we're going to talk about SAP Cloud SDK for JavaScript goes open source. And we have Jordan Jordan, can you pronounce your last name, please?
Jordan
Docadino?
Dukadinov. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Thank you from the SAP Cloud SDK product team. So in case you have questions, you can either use the chat or the Q&A tab. So please take it away, Jordan.
Thank you, Moshe. Hello from my side too. I'm Jordan, developer advocate at the SAP Cloud SDK team. And like Moshe already announced today, I'll talk about how the SAP Cloud SDK for JavaScript open source the component and why we did that. Before I start presenting content, as usual, our forward-looking statement. I'm not announcing anything official today. Some things that I'll show might not be available, and there's no guarantee that everything that I show will be available. So please make your purchasing decisions based on what's available today. All right, as you know, this is an SAP Cloud SDK session. That's why I'll start with a very brief and high-level overview about what the SAP Cloud SDK does and where it's used. So if we have a look at this picture, we see the SAP Cloud Platform and some application running in there, which is ideally built in a cloud-native manner. And that's why we call it a cloud-native application. And to the left, we see different SAP solutions like S4HANA, Qualtrics, Ariba Concur, and others. And this is the first functionality that the SAP Cloud SDK supports, which is the bridge to the left. So it allows cloud-native applications to talk to SAP solutions in a very lightweight manner, using, for example, OData or REST APIs. If we have a look down, then we see the SAP Cloud Platform extension factory and business services, and also a bridge leading from the cloud native application to the bottom, which means that the Cloud SDK also makes it easier to consume SAP Cloud Platform services too. And the last component of the Cloud SDK is visualized on the right side, which is the continuous delivery toolkit, which basically enables developers to automate the deployment process, to accelerate, and also to make it more reproducible. This is basically the overview of the basic functionality that the Cloud SDK offers. Again, we have cloud native applications built on SAP Cloud Platform. All right, just a small recap what kept us busy in the last weeks. For the Java component, we worked very hard to provide support for consuming OData v4 services. Like you saw on the previous slide, one of the very basic functionalities of Cloud SDK is the support to for talking to other SAP solutions, and OData v4 is a standard that is implemented by more and more SAP solutions. So right now it's also implemented in the Java component. On the JavaScript side, we worked towards open sourcing a component, and this is the topic of today's session. So in the next minutes, we'll see more on the open source part that's under JavaScript. Moving forward to the agenda, like already mentioned, the main topic is going open source, and like I showed, it's the open sourcing of the JavaScript component. After I provide an overview of what we did, I move forward to a demo, which will be generating an OData service client for any OData service. So we'll have a look at how I can start with an OData service and actually have some code that invokes this service. And last but not least, I'll try to explain how to move to the latest Cloud SDK version if you already have a JavaScript project that use the SAP Cloud SDK. Obviously, you need to change something in order to continue consuming our latest version. All right, let's talk about open source. So first question is, what exactly did we open source? And in order to explain this more easily, I want to also show this point of view, which is very similar to the first picture that I showed. It's the modularization of the Cloud SDK. And if we have a look to the right, we find again the continuous delivery toolkit, which you already saw on the other picture. Then you see a component that's called SDK core, which is basically the inner box of the bigger ones, right? And inside we have the so-called client libraries for accessing different products, like S4HANA, Marketing Cloud, by design. And if we have a look to the left, we also see Ariba, SAP Cloud Platform, core services, and others. So this is basically a very similar view like this one, but from another angle. Again, to recap, here we see continuous delivery to the right, and in the middle we see the Cloud SDK with the two instances, Cloud SDK for Java and Cloud SDK for JavaScript. And each of these two components for Java and JavaScript support accessing LOB solutions by SAP and others, for example, other OData services, and SAP Cloud Platform core services. So you can imagine these are two dimensions, which makes around 5 components in total. I say around 5 because on this picture we obviously have 6 components. Again, we have 3 main components, which are Cloud SDK for JavaScript, for Java, and for continuous delivery. And if we go through the packages that are inside of these components, we see the SDK core containing the OData client generator, which is available for JavaScript and for Java, like displayed here. Then secondly, we have the virtual data model for accessing SAP S4HANA Cloud that we also ship out of the box for JavaScript and for Java, which is basically the client that allows applications to directly invoke S4HANA Cloud. Then thirdly, for JavaScript, there is a component called command line interface, which contains some commands that automate different things that can be done with a project. For example, if you have an existing Node.js project and decide to try out the Cloud SDK for your existing project, you can simply use the CLI to have your project be enabled to use the Cloud SDK. I'll show a little bit of this in a minute. For Java, we use Maven. That's why we don't have a CLI component. And for continuous delivery, obviously, we have a very different type of component. So that's the reason why there is no CLI component too. And like you see the icons here, many of these components are developed as, let's say, closed source within SAP. These are all the components where you see the SAP logo. And there are some components developed on github.com, which are displayed with the OctoCAD logo here. And the component that we open sourced is the SDK core and OData client generator for JavaScript, which makes our third component that moved to github.com. You might ask yourself why we don't open source everything. there are different reasons for that. And for example, if you have a look at the virtual data model for S/4HANA Cloud, this is something that's not very likely to be open sourced at some point of time because it's based on the S/4HANA Cloud solution, which means that in order to open source this one, we obviously need the support and the permission of S/4HANA Cloud, which as of today is not given. So having a look at this picture, the only thing that has potential to become open source in the future is the SDK core for Java, which is here. But now let's go back to the JavaScript part. We have these repositories on github.com where we develop the different components. Like you might already notice, the point of time where these components became open source is quite different. First was the continuous delivery toolkit. But nevertheless, they are all part of the SDK and can be, the source code and some documentation can be found using these URLs here. You don't need to take screenshots. We'll pass you the slides after this session. All right, this is the same picture, but from a point of view of the developer that doesn't care where the component is developed, but is asking himself or herself where to get the component from. And again, here we see the different sources that developers can use to consume the components. We have the official NPM registry for the open source components. If you remember the previous picture, we had the open source components for JavaScript core, JavaScript command line interface, and continuous delivery toolkit. And all these components are available using the regular and official NPM registry. And then for the virtual data model for JavaScript that's not open sourced, we use the SAP NPM registry. And for Java, it's much easier. We deliver everything over Maven Central. As you know, Java is a language that actually is compiled, so consuming jar files and classes is not the same like viewing the source code. That's why here we can simply use Maven Central as the standard way to deliver Java components. All right, this is a high-level overview of the steps that we needed to consider when we started working towards going open source. First of all, setup of the GitHub repository. It's a very trivial one, of course, we needed to adhere to some corporate policies about naming and which organization on github.com we use and so on. So even if it looks quite trivial, there is some work to do here. But the real work is in the next steps. Obviously, we needed to do some IP scanning. IP is, in this case, the abbreviation for intellectual property, not for internet protocol. So all the network professionals don't wonder. And the scan of intellectual property is basically a tool that SAP uses to check if this project does not expose anything that the company doesn't want to have exposed. Like, for example, if you try to open source the virtual data model, probably we wouldn't pass this IP scanning. And then, of course, a company like SAP has an established open source process that starts with a request with some questions answered, and then the process passes through some departments like legal, for example, and so on. And then we come to steps 4 and 5, which are very technical. And actually, These are, of course, our developers' favorite steps. First of all, we needed to take care of the existing build process. As you know, we release in 2-week cycles. So basically, we had 2 weeks time before the last release from the closed source and the first release of the open source. And in this time frame, everything needed to be fixed and running, at least to build the release. And of course, like I'll show in a minute, we had also some architectural and compatibility considerations to do that simply were not there. For example, if you think about this picture, so far we had one release of the first 2 components for JavaScript, which are the SDK core or data client generator, and the second virtual data model for SAP S/4HANA Cloud. Until open sourcing the first one, we always had one release for these 2 together. So we never needed to care about compatibility between these 2. And after open sourcing the first component, obviously we need to take care that whatever we bring out as a new version of the SDK core, it has to work with the most recent version of the virtual data model, and ideally, of course, with older versions as well. So this is an example of a compatibility consideration. There are also some other considerations which are very similar. And after taking this journey, we basically had the component under github.com/SAP/Cloud SDK. And this takes me to the demo part of this session. Like usual, our demos are safe to try at home, so feel free. Once you get these slides, you can review these links here. And if you have a look at the link, which is at the bottom of this page, this demo is also available as a tutorial on the SAP tutorials page, so that you can actually open the tutorial and follow the steps there. And you also have some explanations. What you need for the demo, if you want to run the app on SAP Cloud Platform, of course, an SAP Cloud Platform account, an SAP API Business Hub account. I'll show in a minute what this is. And some internet connection to github.com so that you can check out Cloud SDK and Cloud SDK CLI. By saying check out, I don't mean cloning them. Of course, you're free to do that, but for the demo, you probably need to simply install them. So yes, from a technical point of view, obviously also NPM registry access, which is publicly available on the internet. And I'll provide the demo by really following the tutorial, so that if you decide to do this at home, you can also review the recording in case there is something that's not behaving as expected. This is the tutorial that you'll see if you click on the link at the bottom of the slide. And I just start following the steps here and explain what happens in each step. So step 1 is install the generator. And here we already see that it's actually installing the CLI component of the Cloud SDK. So I'll go 2 slides back here. It's basically the component here at the bottom that's being installed as step 1. And if you have a Unix-based machine like I have, so a Mac or Linux, then you obviously should do it with sudo, of course, if you install it globally. But you probably know all of that. After we have installed it, I won't do it on my machine because I already have installed it globally, which means that even if I execute this command, nothing will happen. So I'm moving forward to step 2. Okay, step 2 says get familiar with non-S4HANA OData service. Like I said, we are demoing the client library generation for any OData service, which should not be an S4HANA OData service. Why is that requirement? It's simply because if I had OData services from S4 that I want to consume, I wouldn't need to generate anything, because then I would simply use this second component here, which the Cloud SDK delivers out of the box. So that's the reason why the tutorial says you should pick a service that's not S4HANA. Obviously, of course, you could take a service that's from S4HANA, but then you would generate something that's already available in this component. And if you take the entire S4HANA API list and generate clients for all services, then you end up with this VDM component here. But for the sake of this tutorial, we won't use S4HANA, but SuccessFactors, like it says here. And the example service here is the SuccessFactors recruiting service for candidates. And if I click on this link, I'll go to the API Business Hub. And this is the system that I had listed as second part. If I go back to the demo slide here, we are in the SAP API Business Hub. And obviously for this one, I need an account. Right now, I don't need an account yet. I'm not logged in, like you can see here on the right-hand side. But first, let me explain what this Business Hub is actually doing. If I click on the title page, which is api.sap.com, and I have a look to the left, I see many SAP solutions listed here, like S4HANA Cloud, C4HANA, SuccessFactors, Fieldglass, and so on. And I can click on any of these solutions, which will take me, so for example, SuccessFactors will take me to this list here of different SuccessFactors modules. I can also view more. And if I click on one module, let's say this one here, talent management, then I can browse what this module is doing and what kind of APIs it offers. And if I browse a lot, at some point of time, I'll find this candidate service here. Right now, I won't browse it because it will take too much time probably. But here I am viewing a candidate service from SuccessFactors. And what is displayed here is actually how the API of this endpoint looks like. So we see here that this endpoint supports 4 methods. And if I click on any of these methods, I can see some example request and example response and a description of what kind of parameters are expected. This is something that you most likely already know from developing REST APIs. All right, now let's get familiar with the OData service, like the step 2 here says. If I click here on details, it's getting more interesting. What do I see here? I'm still in the candidate service, right? So if I click on details, I see that this service is part of the SuccessFactors recruiting package. And I can download the specification in different formats like JSON, YAML, EDMX. by downloading the specification, basically I'm downloading the information that's available under API reference. So if I download the specification, I'm downloading a machine readable representation of this method here and all the information that is inside of the descriptions. All right, going back to details. If I scroll down, I also see the URLs where this service is running. Yeah, basically there's a sandbox URL, which is available for almost all of the services, and there are different production URLs here. Usually when a customer subscribes this solution from SAP, they will get not only credentials, but also one or more production URLs when they consume the service. So let's try to download the specification because this is what I need. For the SAP Cloud SDK generator, the input file is this specification here, and it should be in EDMX format. All right, and now it asks me to log in, and for this I need the SAP API Hub account. If I log in, it will allow me to download. Like you see here, I already downloaded the file, and then I'm basically done with step 2 of this tutorial. Moving forward to step 3, which is provide the service specification file. Actually, I already did provide it because I downloaded it here. If you read through the tutorial, you see the same that I already showed. You see here we have candidate service and click on details, and then we download the EDMX file. Now it's getting more interesting. Step 4 is actually running the generation. And what's the goal of this step? Let's think about it again. Now I have downloaded the service specification, which is an EDMX file. Let's have a look how it looks like. So here I've already copied it in my directory. And we see that this EDMX file is actually an XML. I can also format it, but this is the way how I got it from the server. And it's a specification of the OData service. Like if we have a closer look, we'll see that it has entity sets, entities, and so on. So this is format that's actually downloadable from any OData endpoint. So if I didn't have this Business Hub, I still could load the metadata description of the OData service. And I'm using this as input for the generator. And what I expect is to get some client libraries that represent the business objects, which are described here in the reference. So first of all, obviously, my client should represent these 4 methods here, and all the operations and the related business objects that are described here inside. So that in the next step, I'm able very easily consuming this service from my source code. And this is exactly what the generator will do. And in order to use the generator, we invoke the generate OData client command of the SAP Cloud SDK CLI. If we look at this picture again, we invoke the CLI component, which is at the bottom, which will implicitly invoke the generator, which is the first one, so that we end up with a client library for success factors. And this is what I will do now. And for that, I will simply copy this command and run it on my machine. So what do we have here? Input directory and output directory. If you wonder why we specify an input directory instead of the EDMX file itself, the reason for that is that sometimes you not only want to generate client libraries for one service, but maybe you have 2 or more services, so that you end up with a bunch of EDMX files, and you can copy them all together in one directory and simply specify it as input directory. And this is what I did on my local machine. If we have a look here, I have this service specifications directory, and inside I have this candidate EDMX file. So now let's run this command like in the tutorial. All right, nothing happened. And I already see the reason why nothing happens. It's because I have a typo here, because my local directory is service specifications with S, like we see here. And if I run this with the correct input, I'll hopefully end up with some generated content. And like we see, we already generated here the OData client directory. If we have a look inside, we see different things. We see a lot of TS files and also a lot of JS files. But more interesting is that if we have a look at the naming, it's something like, so the first ones are obviously the business objects, and then we have something like candidate background certificates and so on. And if I look at the candidate service here, I actually see that the generator simply used these names here. So these are the services or operations, and inside we have a lot of business objects. And all of these things are now represented by the generated content here. Another interesting thing that got generated is this service mapping.json file. And why it is interesting, we'll see in a second. But before that, let's have a look at the tutorial again and go to the next step. So right now, I executed this command and already have some TypeScript and JavaScript files. I see there is a question in Q&A. I'll answer the question at the end. Also, the tutorial says that having a look at this file is highly recommended at service mapping that I already opened. And why is that so important? It's simply because the thing that I generated right now is not directly runnable. And the reason for that is that if I look at the candidate service again and click on details again, I see that all these URLs here where the service is actually running end with OData/v2, which is the path. You see that it's the same for all URLs. And this is also a piece of information that I should provide to the generator. And this is the reason why we have this file here. And we see here service path, which is now this generated value. Value is undefined. And the generator expects here either this special key constant, which means, all right, we don't have a service path, ignore it. But in most cases, we have a service path, and that's why we should specify this OData/v2 here. And it's exactly what's described in the tutorial as well. Like we see here, this is how the file should look like, and this is the line that's replaced. And it's simply saying, all right, use this path as part of the URL, so that I'll do it also here locally. And like usual, with generated content, when we change something like this, which is in the input directory, by the way, then we obviously need to regenerate. And that's why maybe it's a good idea to run the generator, for example, as part of an automated build process or something like this. And right now I changed the input, and I need to regenerate. If I execute the same command, actually nothing will happen, because the generator will find this output directory here and basically ignore what's already generated. In order to avoid it, I could either delete this directory, or I can use this force override flag. So this line in the tutorial is exactly the same command like the above one, but with the flag. And like already mentioned, this flag is very useful if you generate files as part of an automated process, for example. All right, if I run it now, then obviously it will regenerate all the files. Once this is finished, actually I'm ready to run my code, which happens in step 5. And here we see already coding examples on how to run it. But to close the circle, I'll open this directory again. So here we see the generated content, and like mentioned, we have a lot of JS and TS files. So whatever you are using, TypeScript or JavaScript, you can simply use these generated files here. And in order to do them, you need to require them, and that's it. There are different mechanisms on how to require this content. So you can either copy it into your project or package into separate module. But however you do it, at some point of time, you will be able to import or require. And yeah, like for example, candidate, or if we have a look here below, I didn't copy this code into my VS Code, so that's why I'm showing it here in the tutorial directly. This is how the code looks like that's actually invoking the candidate service. And what we see here is that basically what we get in response, so let's start with the response, is an array of business objects, which are the candidate objects. And guess what? These objects look exactly like they are described here in the API Business Hub and in the service endpoint. But not only this business object is exactly like I want to have it, but also the properties here were also generated, so that I can do some selects or some filtering on them. And I have some generic functionality like get all, top, and so on. Like you might think, this is actually the code that gives me directly this array here, and I don't need to care about connectivity, about security, about generating the HTTP request and parsing the response and so on. Everything is capsuled. So by using this generated client library, I'm also using some more functionality from the Cloud SDK that is already built into this generated client. That's why this first component here is actually SDK core and generator, because once the generator is used to generate the client, then it already has core functionality built in. And this is how easy it is to actually, for example, read candidates like this service is doing here. Also, we see that the Cloud SDK has some different security concepts built into them. So, for example, for accessing SuccessFactors, we need API keys. For accessing S/4HANA, we might need some other authentication mechanisms. They are already built in. And what also can be used is the destination configuration of the SAP Cloud Platform, which means that if I'm building apps for the SAP Cloud Platform, it's actually even easier because I can do all this configuration outside of my application, and I wouldn't even need to hard code the URL like here. Which is, of course, a big advantage. We never should hard code URLs and API keys. This is actually a bad practice, but for this example of the tutorial here, it's good enough, I think. All right, this is how the generator works. Before moving back to the slides, I'll stay a little more in my favorite program. So if I have a look at my project here, like already mentioned on the slide, we have dependencies that we consume from the NPM registry, which is the public one. And we also have some components that we use from the SAP NPM registry. And in Node.js, we have namespaces for that. You probably know this file here, npm-rc. This is used for specifying custom registries, like this one, for example, which basically tells me that all dependencies in this project that begin with at SAP will be downloaded from this registry. No rocket science here, but if we have a look at the generated content, we also get this file generated here. So we obviously should never simply replace this file in our project by the generated one, because in our project we might have also some other configurations here. But if you wonder what the URL for the NPM registry of SAP is, then you can find it here. Other than that, what I have here is a very regular Node.js project where I should actually copy the code from my tutorial. And if you follow the tutorial very carefully, you'll see that it points to another tutorial where you create an app using the Cloud SDK for JavaScript. So I'm still in step 5. And if you really follow this tutorial and are not very familiar with Node.js, you can simply click this link here and then have this project generated where you really can copy paste this into it. All right, that concludes the demo part. When you get the slides, you can find the link here at the bottom of the demo slide. What we worked with so far was entirely the Cloud SDK for JavaScript. So we had no continuous delivery involved in that. Okay, next question is how to update existing projects so that they keep using the latest SAP Cloud SDK version. First of all, we need to have a look at what changed with us having open sourced the component. First of all, we changed some package names. Like you already saw at SAP/package name, is now renamed to at SAP Cloud SDK / package name. If you remember the npm-rc file, this will mean that the old packages will be consumed from the SAP npm registry, while the new ones from the public one. Then secondly, like already mentioned, now that we split up the virtual data model component from the core component, we have two different release cycles. And SDK core and the generator are still in the bi-weekly mode, like you're familiar with, like it always was. And the virtual data model component, which was the second one, now has a release frequency of the S/4HANA Cloud release frequency. So it's aligned because obviously we don't need to produce more and more releases of the virtual data model component that are based on the same S/4HANA Cloud version, because simply it does not change. What's noteworthy here is that the license for github.com needed to be changed to Apache license 2.0. And without providing legal advice here, I can say that it shouldn't have any implications for your project. So it's safe to simply keep using the component like it is. But if you have a very specific legal case, then obviously it's best to consult the legal department. If you have a look at this link here at the bottom, it will take you to a page containing more information on what exactly to change. I can also click it. So here we see the same table with the renamed components, and here below we obviously have some more explanation, how to replace the dependency in the package JSON, and then how to replace the requires in the source code. What is noteworthy here is that when I replace the dependencies and update the new package names in the package.json, when I do npm install after that, I obviously will get the content downloaded into my node modules directory, but be aware that this would not remove the old components, so that your code might keep working on your local machine, simply because the old components will remain in node modules. So it's best to either remove these components or delete node modules. This is just a small hint. Other than that, we don't have any other things that changed. What did not change? First of all, I was asked the question if open sourcing a component means that we want to step back from developing it and want to stop investing in it. The answer is definitely no. The team engagement and commitment to quality and updates and further development remains the same. So it's not affected at all by open sourcing the component. Secondly, our quality standards. It's true that we are not bound to the SAP corporate quality standards anymore when we release from github.com. But still, the team decided to stick to these standards and to provide the best possible quality, which means that you shouldn't expect a decrease in quality. On the opposite, we hope that we can use some new features to accelerate the release process and ideally to even improve the quality. And last but not least, there were no breaking changes in the APIs introduced, so that it should be really safe to basically consume the new components like displayed in the table on this page, adjust the dependencies and requires, and then fire. Should all work. And these are the two steps that need to be done to existing projects, like already mentioned. Update dependencies and update requires. And having said this, again, I want to show the different channels, how to reach out to us. So if you decide to try out the Cloud SDK, or if you already use the Cloud SDK and have a specific question, you can either use the public channels, Stack Overflow and SAP community, or you can send us an email. And if you are new to Cloud SDK or simply want to keep track on what others are posting and talking about, you can start with the tutorials or the SAP community area, and do not forget to use the tag SAP Cloud SDK so that you get notified for new content. This concludes my session for today, and now I am opening up for questions. I remember that there was a question here in Q&A, so let me try to open it. Okay, it doesn't work. Moshe, can you maybe read the questions, because I have trouble opening it?
Yes, no problem. So we have one question. Hello, if I generate OData clients from my S4 on-prem instance, say version 1809, am I allowed to include them in my open source project? I will have to segregate generated OData client library from my source, as you did in Cloud SDK. And if I use them in a commercial product, I will need an agreement with SAP to distribute them.
All right, this is a little bit legal, so I do not want to provide a guarantee on the correctness, but I would say if you generate something out of the API description of SAP products, like for example, S4HANA on-prem, then you are probably not allowed to open source it, because it still remains intellectual property of SAP, and that's the reason why it's protected by the login of the SAP Business Hub. So I would say you are not allowed to open source the generated content, but again, for more specific opinion, probably the legal department should be asked.
Great, thank you. And another question is, what are the reasons or limit for not using the new SAP Business Application Studio in this demo?
There is no reason. So this demo is of course fully compatible with the Business Application Studio. The reason is simply because this demo can be also executed locally. Like everything that I showed was on my local machine. So here in, okay, this is the Q&A. All right. Thank you. Everything I have here is executable locally. And obviously, if you use the Web Application Studio, you will be in the cloud and you can do the same things. So it's not exclusive. But the sake of this tutorial is really to be very easily followable and reproducible, so that anyone can try out the things. So the reason is, the only reason is maybe that we didn't want to require and force the people to have access to the studio. Any other questions?
No, I think that's it.
All right, then thank you for your time. Thanks for joining. And once you get the slides, feel free to try out the demo and to reach out to us for any other questions.
Thank you very much.
Back to you, Moshe.